of the Pacific. Good evening to everyone who are in the United States. We just, I guess all those on the other side of the Pacific, you just had a very eventful Golden Week, particularly if you look at the past 7 days through the lens of US-China relationship. Number one, I can think of three things. Number one, the blockbuster movie, The Battle of Caojing Reservoir. It broke all kinds of records, but more importantly, the movie itself has triggered a national debate on something that Professor Xu is going to deal with today. That is the history. How do you tell this history, and what kind of lessons can we draw from this history? The second is the Chinese PLA Air Force planes flying into the air defense identification zone in Taiwan, largely in response to AUKUS, as well as to the joint military exercise in the Indo-Pacific theater. Of course, a minor event would be the nuclear submarine Connecticut being hit by an unknown object. We don't know what happened down there. Lastly, of course, is the meeting at the airport in Zurich between Yang Jiechi and Jake Sullivan. Now, on the US side, of course, things are not necessarily quiet. We do have Catherine Tai, who made her first China trade policy remarks, to widespread disappointment by those who are watching very keenly the relationship. Of course, President Biden, in answering questions to the reporters, talked about the Taiwan agreement. To many on the China side, this is great, because when he said, if we abide by Taiwan agreement, everything is going to be fine, which seems to signify US is still adhering to the one China policy. And of course, for President Biden himself, largely, it's really a battle of life and death, is to get the debt ceiling raised, but at the same time, to get his two other bills, the infrastructure bill and the welfare bill, passed, which will have huge impact on midterm as well as on the presidential election in 2024. But we have prepared something very special today. They're related to the things I've talked about, but they're also different. We tend to focus on politicians, political leaders, military, other relationship. We tend to neglect a very important dimension of the relationship, which is people to people. And today, it's not just ordinary people to people relationship. It's looking at the relationship from 1872 to 2022 from the lens of sport. Our speaker is Professor Xu Guoqi. Xu Guoqi, I just dropped a link of Xu Guoqi's bio at University of Hong Kong website. There are a lot of details over there. I don't want to spend too much time talking about, his really very impressive achievement, not just, as a historian, but also as a public intellectual. If you go through reports, like I did recently, Guoqi was quoted extensively in all the reports about the upcoming Winter Olympic Games, because his book on China's Olympic game came right before Beijing Summer Olympic Games. That certainly made Guoqi is really a cultural phenomenon. He grew up in Anhui, went to Anhui Normal University, and then all three of us, I think we're embodiment of US-China relationship in the era of reform and the opening up. He went to study at Harvard University, got his PhD, started teaching in the US, and eventually settled in the University of Hong Kong. Our discussant is Hanchao Lu. He went to UCLA and got his PhD, and he's also very famous for his writing and researching of the social history of China. One of his award-winning book is Under the Neon Light, Shanghai in the 1930s. And I want to let everybody know that his upcoming book, which I think will be published by University of Cambridge Press, as was told last night during the practice session, will be again on Shanghai, but Shanghai during after liberation, I guess, from 1949 all the way, I don't know to what point Hanzhao can share with us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn microphone to Guoqi. So Guoqi, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Yao-Wei. Also, I would like to thank the Carter Center and China Research Center of Atlanta for sponsoring this event. Of course, I'm very grateful to Yao-Wei and Hanzhao. Both of them are my very old good friend since last century. Also, since I think Yao-Wei mentioned it's in China, it's a national holiday, Golden Weekend holiday, right? So we celebrate the National Day. Also, I would like to use this opportunity to say happy birthday to former President Jimmy Carter. He was born in the same year as the People's Republic of China was founded. Yao-Wei, is that right? October 1st.
Yeah, he shared the birthday with PRC.
Yeah, that's right. So the belated birthday celebration to former President Jimmy Carter. So today, basically, I'm sharing my thoughts about U.S.-China relations from very strange lens, the sports. So I'm very virtual participant of sports. Even I don't play ping pong like many other my friends in China can play, but I basically become interested or obsessed with sports, especially Olympic Games, since for last 2 decades. So today I'm going to basically just talk about how to understand U.S.-China relations from
recording in progress
from sports perspective. Actually, this is a perfect time for us to think about U.S.-China relations from perspective of sports or Olympic Games. As we all know, 50 years ago, ping pong diplomacy brought U.S.-China together in a much better relationship, right? So this year is the 50th anniversary of ping pong diplomacy. Ping pong diplomacy, of course, as we joke about last night with Hanzhao and Yao-Wei, we tend to focus on diplomacy, forgot ping pong, the sports. So today I'm going to bring the ping pong, the game back. But last thing, of course, this year is a quite extraordinary for Olympic Games because for some, we all know the reason that Tokyo Olympic Games was postponed to this year. So we just finished Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games recently. That's given me a lot of thought to think about U.S.-China relations from Olympic perspective. Another thing, of course, as Yao-Wei just mentioned, Beijing or Zhangjiakou are going to host Winter Olympic Games in early February. So about four months now, or less than 5 months from now. Then, of course, in Hangzhou, we're going to host Asian Games next year. Then I guess for those of us who are obsessed with football or World Cup, we know the Chinese men's team had a quite extraordinary game against Vietnam just yesterday. So next year, we're going to have a FIFA World Cups. Hopefully, Chinese men will qualify, but we never know. Many years ago, I joke about maybe it takes Chinese men earlier to land on moons than our men to land it on the World Cup. Anyway, so that's basically give me some motivation or background to think about this talk, because Yao-Wei has asked me to give a talk on U.S.-China relations for a while. I always drag my feet. So now basically I'm going to talk about U.S.-China relations from sports perspective. Again, just as I put here, most importantly, how to understand Sino-American relations. Because 50 years ago, that's a different Sino-American relations. Now we seem to enter the new stage or new page of U.S.-China relations. So basically, I'm going to spend less than hopefully 45 minutes or about to talk about 3 topics I'm going to share with all our friends today here, wherever you are. So the first one, the sports as a shared history between Chinese and Americans between 1872 to 2008. The second one, as I already briefly mentioned, about ping-pong diplomacy in Sino-American relation. The third one, the present and future Sino-American relations or competitions through Olympic Games and Olympic history of Anglo-American rivalry. Because remember, UK used to be a superpower. Then, starting from late 19th century, the new emerging superpower, United States, replaced UK gradually. Actually, the major perspective to understand Anglo-American rivalry, actually, I think is the best through Olympic Games. So that's I'm going to talk about as well. So that's 3 topics. Let's go back to China's education mission, because the reason I started to talk about U.S.-China relations through sports from 1872, we all know the China's first central government-sponsored study abroad mission took place in 1872, when the Great Qing Empire sent our first central government-sponsored study abroad mission to the United States. So that basically brought us together about so-called sport exchanges between Chinese Americans in the sort of extraordinary way. Usually, even we don't pay much attention to it. Before I briefly talk about Chinese boy students in US and their obsession with the American national games, we have to pay attention to another mission, so-called Burlingame mission. I think for those of us, we are all basically heard a lot of common, like Henry Kissinger or Richard Nixon, our Chinese old friend. As far as I'm concerned, Anson Burlingame was China's true American friend, because when he died, he was a Chinese employee in 1870. When at age 49, that's basically, I think this picture is quite familiar to all of us. The person who stands in the center was China's first de facto head of diplomatic mission to the world. Anson Burlingame, the US top diplomat in Beijing from 1861 to 1867, or before he became Chinese ambassador to the world. There, see, that's another photo. You can see the Anson Burlingame sit there. The 2 Chinese junior officials accompany him. So largely because the Burlingame mission, then the Chinese first start abroad mission took place in US. Because for those of us who pay attention to the Burlingame Treaty, in 1868, in the Article 7, it says the Chinese student and American student were welcome to go to each other's country to study. That's why when Li Hundan and Deng Guofan decided to send China's first start abroad mission, they basically immediately thought it was US. So now let's go back to the first group of Chinese boy students to US. That's a photo. I guess we're all familiar now. Before they arrive in US, they have a official portrait taken, like the photo taken. They all with a so-called 长袍马褂, right? With cues. Then actually when we think about we only have 120 students in 4 years period to end up in the United States to study. They're supposed to be in US for 15 years, but for some very complicated background, the mission was recorded early in 1881. So when only very few students finish university education, most of them even just were admitted to the American universities or in the middle of their college studying. Some of them even did not manage to go to college. But we also know this group of 120 students, some of them died in Chinese war against France in 1884. A few of them died when China fought the war with Japan in 1895. But for those of them who survived, who returned to China, they all became distinguished in each other's in a very unique way. For example, Tang Shaoyi, he was the first premier of prime minister of Republic of China. And Yang Chen, another person who ended up become China's top minister to US in 1805. In 1908, he persuaded American government to return the box money to sponsor the box scholarship. We all know Chen Xuesen, Hu Shi benefit from this. So that I only mentioned the two examples who played enormous role in Sino-American relations. But of course, for today's purpose, I'm going to talk about this group of Chinese boy students who are not only brilliant students in US, extraordinary citizens in China, or basically contribute enormously to Sino-American relations, but also basically I will draw our attention to their achievement in sports, how sports became the shared history between Chinese Americans. So I will, because of time constraint, only focus on three examples. The one, I don't know how many of you heard about Zhong Wenyao. For those of you who have a connection with Yale University, I think you should remember him because he used to be treated by his counterpart at Yale as a hero. Before we talk about Zhong Wenyao, we have to go back to the Harvard-Yale boat race or competitions. That competition started in 1852. I think it's the earliest sport competition in the United States. So the competition between Yale and Harvard was, of course, was more than sports. There's so many interesting history between two universities get involved. Not only this Harvard-Yale boat race was one of the oldest sports events in US, also basically it's a very influential in American politics, US higher education. Let me just give you one very brief example. In 1908, the boat competition will take place between Harvard and Yale. Just before the game started, Harvard president Charles Gillett, by the way, he was a president of Harvard since 1869. So by 1908, he decided to retire 1 year later in 1909. 1908, of course, another Harvard man was in White House as the president of the United States. That's we all know it's a Theodore Roosevelt, or TR, the Rough Rider, right? So the 1908 was the last year of him as the president of the United States. So he paid enormous attention to the game between Harvard and Yale. Obviously he want Harvard to win. So when he read the news, Harvard president Charles Gillett, the legendary president of Harvard, decided to punish 3-star Harvard crew athlete because they committed sort of a crime. Literally took some books illegally from Harvard Library. So Charles Gillett need to teach them a lesson, so get them off of the competition. So TR, or Theodore Roosevelt, was very angry. He sent a very angry letter to Charles Gillett, saying it was not a good idea to punish our star athlete student when the game took place. Of course, Charles Gillett did not back down, even give him the president of the United States lesson about the virtue, about the high principle. Luckily for both, Harvard won that year, so that Theodore Roosevelt was happy to see his his beloved University won. So that's just give you one example about the significance of a small so-called sport event between two not famous for sports university in US. So now let's return to Zhong Wenyao. Zhong Wenyao was one of boys students of 120. He was born in 1860. So he was in 1880. He was selected as a coxswain by Yale College. Coxswain in Chinese, I guess, is a 舵手. I have a photo. Let me show you the photo. That's one that Zhong Wenyao sit at the coxswain at the head of the boat. So coxswain was very important position. It's something like a coach in the boat, steering, executing race strategy. So what's quite important, even he or she did not contribute physically to the game, but was very significant. So in 1880, when the boat race supposed to take place between Harvard and Yale, a Chinese boy, and it's about 5.2 feet tall, 90 pounds. It's a tiny person, right? But he was selected as coxswain for that year's game. So he was treated as a giant hero, even he was a tiny man from China, because that year he helped Yale team to beat Harvard. So that's again, that's the boat. Now, by the way, for those of us who pay attention to Chinese sports program, China tried to bring Nenzhou, the dragon boat competition, to the international. Zhong Wenyao, again, more than almost many years ago, actually did very well in the first major sport event in US. So that's one example I would like to bring us to attention to the boy students' contribution or shared history between I got this photo from Yale's archive. So for those of you who are interested, they have more photos like this, so you can see how Zhong Wenyao was treated as a hero. Also, by the way, remember one of several reasons why the Chinese education mission was recorded early, because 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese was treated very unfairly because anti-Chinese opinions in US. But Zhong Wenyao and many others Chinese boy students was respected deeply, especially through their involvement in sports. Because in US, for all of us who observe American society well, if you can do well on sports arena, they will treat you very well. Another person is called Cao Jiaxiang. That's let me show you his photo. That's Mr. Cao Jiaxiang. When he was in United States as one of boy students, he was obsessed with hunting. So that basically that's he's a big hunting gun. When his mission was recorded, he gave this gun to his best friend, or eventually become very famous English professor at Yale. So for those of you for those of us who are interested in their legacy in US, actually the Phelps, that's a famous English professor at Yale, he spent the giant chapter to describe his best friend from China, including Cao Jiaxiang. The most important case or example I would like to share with us is this. I think you remember in the first photo I show you that Chinese boy student in the typical Chinese traditional way. Now in 1878, they organized themselves as one of very successful baseball club. They were so successful, basically, even most of baseball clubs in the northeast part of US would like to play with them. But also we are so surprised to know actually their record was quite extraordinary. So usually they won. So when they record to China in 1881, so they all want to California to wait for boats to bring them back to China. So when they were in California to wait for the boat, they played a game with the Oakland baseball team. The Oakland baseball team did not realize how powerful our man was in baseball team, in the baseball skills. So the Chinese boy student, they defeat the Oakland baseball team in a very surprise way. So that's again the reason why I started about sports in U.S.-China relations with referring to boy student starting from 1872. So that's basically where the one thing that when they were supposed to say farewell to U.S., they celebrate the farewell with a big victory at Oakland in 1881. So now basically before we finish the boy students, so last year, as we briefly mentioned earlier, the Beijing's Winter Olympic Games took place. As I could guarantee you, the Chinese media will talk about another star of boy student, Zhang Qianyou. Zhang Qianyou was a brilliant engineer. He was one of very few who graduated from college. He, of course, we all remember, he designed the railway between Zhangjiakou and Beijing. So that unfortunately he died very young in 1919, barely 60 years old. So now let's return to another part of shared history through sports between U.S.-China relations. Let's fast forward to 1895. China was defeated by Japan. Then one of very famous Chinese intellectuals or translators, Yan Fu, wrote something in his article published in Tianjin in early 1895. Basically, I put the red color there. He basically was the first person to my understanding, or at least Chinese scholar, he called China as a sick man. 中国者故病夫也, right? So from 1895, Yan Fu, Liang Qichao, Sun Yat-sen, or Chairman Mao all talk about how to use sports to save China. So they basically say, because China as a civilization declined, we have to learn from Western civilization. We have to learn from Western sports to make China strong. So basically to use the sports to save China, or the warlike spirit, became the buzzword in China. So that's basically, but that year, 1895, by the way, was important for us in several ways. First, the social Darwinism became widespread in US, in the West, as well in China. Then also basically in 1894, a Frenchman by name Pierre de Coubertin founded modern Olympic Games, with the first modern Olympic Games took place in 1896. Then also basically quite interestingly, that year, same year in 1895, when Chinese start to think about about so-called new idea of China, idea of Chineseness, American YMCA set up its first branch in China, in Tianjin to be precise, in 1895. So I will basically argue that the Pierre de Coubertin was the founder of modern Olympic Games. So I will argue that American YMCA in China was instrumental in bringing China to the world sports, in using sports to serve US-China relations. So in 1908, games, an Olympic game took place in London. I will return to that game later on. The American YMCA secretaries in Tianjin basically already explained to Chinese about Olympic Games, about the implications of Olympic Games to China and to the world. So I think for some of us maybe here will recognize this gentleman, Zhang Bonim, the founding president of Lankai University. He basically, Zhang Bonim became influential citizen of China as actually as a secretary of YMCA. So because of his involvement in YMCA, he eventually became very influential in sports in China. So that's basically for those of us who are interested in Zhang Bonian's handwriting. So he basically from early days, he talked about how if China want to become strong, become powerful, we have to pay attention to sports. But again, he got this idea of what sports through his American counterpart in YMCA. This one, that article called 体育之研究 with the author's name 28化身. We all know 28化身 was Mao Zedong. So this article was published in 1917 in the April issue of New Youth, 新青年. So even this, I think we all know so far, it's the most first published article. It's on sports. So again, the point I try to make, so sports for Chinese, nothing to do with sport per se, nothing to do with a personal joy. It's have everything to do about the nation, about the national honor, national pride, or national shame. So from Zhang Bonian to Sun Yat-sen to Liang Qichao to Mao Zedong, they all talk about how to use the sports. But again, when we think about sports, we think about Olympic Games, we have to think about the YMCA's contribution to this. This book, unfortunately, I'm not good photographer. That's a book I found it at Hong Kong University Library. This is the first book written by Chinese about Olympic Games. That's at that time they called the 世界运动会, right? It's an Olympic game. For those of you who have a sharp eyesight, you can see the 4 Chinese characters there. It's called 我能比, I can compete. That also sounds similar to the Olympiad, right? Because that's the official name of Olympic Games now. So basically, for this first published book by Chinese scholar, he also, by the way, by name Sun Yuhai, was a secretary of YMCA in Hankou or Wuhan. So that basically just that sense of I can compete or 我能比, convey the strong meaning of sports, of Olympic Games to China. That again, Americans play important role in that development. Let's return to the Tianjin's YMCA official magazine called Tianjin Young Man or Tianjin 青年. So in its 1808 article, they talk about 3 dreams of China's 3 dreams. Yes. 3 dreams. One, of course, when China or Chinese would take part in Olympic Games. The second dream was when Chinese will win the first gold medal. The third dream, when China will host Olympic Games. The Chinese eventually achieved all these 3 dreams one by one, surprisingly with strong US connection. Right, so the first time the Chinese achieved is a dream to take part in Olympic Games was in 1932, when Los Angeles was host to the Olympic Games, 1932. So in the beginning, the Chinese did not want to send anybody to the Olympic Games, but we all know for major Japan started to invade China in 1931. Then basically in 1932, it established the puppet state, Manchu Guo. So that the Chinese heard about Manchu Guo's intention to send athletes to Los Angeles game in order to legitimize the puppet state. So the Chinese immediately decide to send our own athlete. So American host or IOC, International Olympic Committee, did not welcome Manchu Guo, but they did welcome the Chinese athlete. Even eventually, China only managed to send 1 athlete. I will show you the picture of him. So the reason why Americans was friendly to China of welcoming Chinese, even China was late to submit all the paperwork, because we know in the early 1932, in the middle of Great Depression in US, also in the middle of isolationism in the United States. American Secretary of State Henry Stimson issued so-called Stimson Doctrine, literally say the United States did not recognize the Japanese invasion of China, right? So that's one thing. So that's basically because that background, the host of Olympic Games, Los Angeles, welcomed the only one athlete from China, Liu Changchun. So that, in other words, Chinese first participation in Olympic Games has something to do with diplomacy, has something to do with a shared history between Chinese and Americans. So Liu Changchun, of course, when he went there, he kept a detailed diary about his interactions with Americans. He's also talked about his contribution to U.S.-China relations or Chinese diplomacy. Even Liu Changchun, his best score or record in LA was number 6. That means did not win any medal, but his role in U.S.-China relations through Olympic Games was significant. That's another photo here. So the second Olympic game dream achieved also through U.S. So as many of us know, in 1958, Beijing withdrew from IOC, from International Olympic Movement, or all international sports federations because of Taiwan issue. So in other words, PRC withdrew from Olympic movement to protest America's so-called two-China policy. Then eventually in 1979, China returned to Olympic Games. So obviously, when China returned to Olympic Games, they want try to join the Moscow game in 1980 immediately. But then, of course, Yahweh actually helped me a lot several years ago when I tried to pinpoint the Chinese the document from Jimmy Carter Archives Library from Hua Guofen, the premier Hua. Basically, when Jimmy Carter, the president of the United States, issued the worldwide call to boycott Moscow game to protest Moscow's invasion of Afghanistan, he issued the international call on January 20th, 1980. The Chinese government immediately followed Jimmy Carter's call. Then basically, Hua Guofen, our premier, sent him a one-page letter in Chinese, literally say, we will follow you 100% to boycott. So that basically the Chinese or PRC's first real participation in Olympic Games did not become reality until 4 years later. By the way, PRC did take part in 1952 Olympic Games, but Chinese delegation arrived one day before the closing ceremony in 1952. That means basically did not take part in any real serious competition. But for Joe and I, he explained to be late was not our fault. To raise the 5-star national flag in Helsinki, that city hosts the Olympic game in '52 was a victory. So again, China indeed did not manage to attend Moscow 1980 Olympic game, but China, by the way, PRC did manage to return to Olympic Games in US in 1980 by attending the Winter Olympic Games. So now that's again, you can see obviously the strong connection with US. Now let's return to the second dream of Chinese second dream with Olympic Games, so-called Olympic dream, 1984 Games. So 52 years after 1932 Los Angeles Games, 52 years later, the Olympic Games took place in Los Angeles again. China, because the Chinese followed the boycott campaign with US. So when Chinese delegation arrived in Los Angeles in 1984, the Chinese delegation was welcomed at the dining. So when Chinese delegation showed up in the opening ceremony of 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games, almost 100,000 participants in the opening ceremony gave the Chinese delegation a standing ovation. You can imagine how the Chinese were welcome at that time. Of course, that Olympic Games also is a turning point for Chinese Olympic dream, also for U.S.-China relations. So Xu Guoqi won is the first gold medal of 1984 Olympic Games. Also, it turned out is the first gold medal the Chinese have ever won in Olympic Games. Also, 1984 Olympic Games was lucky event for China. Instead of one Olympic gold medal, China ended up to win 15 of them, including Chinese women's volleyball team defeated American volleyball team by winning the gold medal. Then, of course, Long Zhujie won the gold medal in fence. So that's very, very extraordinary year. Of course, that year, by the way, our Premier Zhao Ziyang visited the United States, was very successful. Then Reagan visited Fudan University, visited China, was very successful. So it's an extraordinary year in association with the Olympic exchanges between Chinese Americans. So now let's return to the search. Hopefully this image will cheer up each of us, especially when the lecture become a little bit boring. So the third dream, when China will host Olympic Games, that's of course, we all know 2008. By the way, American president or sitting president never attended opening ceremony, Olympic Games ceremony anywhere in the world. I guess remember in 2012 when London hosted Olympic Games, Obama sent his wife or first lady there. So this year in Tokyo, Joe Biden sent the first lady there. It's if my memory is correct, it's the first time a sitting president of the United States attended opening ceremony. That's in our 2008 Olympic Games. George W. Bush attended, spent 5 days in Beijing with his wife. Obviously, you can see he seems quite happy in Beijing. So that's one photo here. That's another one, all in Beijing. So my point I try to make here, through all the Chinese interaction with Olympic Games, starting from 1895 to 2008, especially in terms of three dreams the Chinese have with the Olympic Games, United States get involved deeply. Not only introduced through YMCA, introducing Olympic Games to the Chinese by hosting the Chinese first participant, Liu Changchun in 1932, then welcome treat China as a very close ally in 1984, then in 2008. That, I guess, now is the highest point of U.S.-China relations when George W. Bush was in China. So now I guess I have to speed up. Oh gosh. Let me turn to Ping-Pong. I guess the story is quite familiar. So Ping-Pong diplomacy took place 50 years ago. We all tend to focus on diplomacy, forgot Ping-Pong. But Ping-Pong, the sports that have to be emphasized here. Again, Chairman Mao, before he becomes the chairman, or the chairman of People's, after 1949, he actually paid attention to sports. As I also mentioned earlier, his first published article was on sport. That Chairman Mao. So of course, that very famous photo now, Zhou Nai. The person who, by the way, even before Ping-Pong diplomacy between U.S., Zhou Nai played with our friend from Africa, the Marshal Chen Yi was there watching. That's another one. So when Chinese play Ping-Pong, then Marshal Holland, Mao, and others were watching. So that basically before the Ping-Pong diplomacy between Chinese and Americans, the Chinese leaders actually have honed their skills in sports diplomacy for quite a long time. Then have to return to the March 1971 during the Cultural Revolution, because largely tried to improve Sino-American relations. Chairman Mao himself personally decided to send Chinese Ping-Pong delegation to Japan, take the 31 World Table Tennis competition. Then because the Chairman Mao and Zhou Enlai would like to basically to improve U.S.-China relations. So both of them follow what's going on in Japan through the games closely. So when this American young ping pong player by name Cohen basically end up in the wrong bus that's used by the Chinese delegation, he and Zhang Zedong had a very quite famous handshake or gift exchange that give Chinese leaders, especially Chairman Mao, an idea to invite American ping pong delegation to China. That's, by the way, the first official delegation arrived from US to China after 49. So when Chairman Mao basically invite ping pong team to the Great War, we all know, as Zhou and I said, the small ball that ping pong shakes the globe, 小球转动大球. So again, when we talk about the ping pong diplomacy, we since I don't have too much time to go to details, we have to go back to sport. Without the Chinese the skills in sports, also without the deep sports connection between the Americans and Chinese as early as 1872, it's a very difficult to say you can basically improve Sino-American relation in the big way overnight. So when Americans end up in Beijing, of course, we all know the Sino-American relations enter the new stage. So again, we don't have too much time, but when Chinese ping pong team eventually return to have a return visit to US, they played the ping pong diplomacy in United Nations headquarters. Unfortunately, I do not have time to show you the video. You can see the top diplomats from world. They almost broke their necks, just keep watching the ping and pong between the Chinese athletes. See, that's one picture, our star as a ping pong player in UN. All right, now that's my brief take on ping pong diplomacy, given the time. So in 1971, of course, US-China relations was in a different stage. Now, 50 years later, we enter another stage. So what now? That's again, I guess, for this audience, we all have some ideas. Now, let me turn to maybe in about less than 12 minutes to talk about the history of American Olympic dreams and its rise, also basically how to understand future US-China relation from sport. So because we all know China is a so-called very important world power just after US. The talking head or scholars, politicians, diplomats, we all talk about what will happen between the superpower and next superpower between China and US, right? I think to ponder that question, it's a good idea for us to think about how United States replaced UK peacefully through sport. I mentioned earlier in 1894, the modern Olympic Games was founded, modern Olympic movement was founded by Coubertin. That historians were still debating when exactly US became superpower economically, but we all agree by 1894, United States was economic superpower. But it took United States almost half century to become superpower in the world, diplomatically, militarily, right? But in terms of the rivalry between US and UK, that basically started immediately after United States become economic superpower in late 19th century. Let me give you just one example here about 1908 London Olympic Games. That's the first Olympic game was introduced to China by YMCA secretaries in US YMCA secretaries in China. So that year, London was hosting Olympic Games. Also, that's the first time, if my memory was right, that basically the Olympic game had the opening ceremony. Because UK was very unhappy with the United States. So remember, the United States became independent from UK a while ago. The United Kingdom treated US as a so-called the barbarian nation, did not have basically was not qualified to be a world leader. So because of a major rivalry between them, So for the London Olympic Games, the host decided not to have an American national flag there. Basically, their excuse, they did not find any American national flag. Then, of course, U.S. delegation was angry with UK. They basically, because when the delegation passed through the British King position, you have to use a so-called to dip your national flag in order to show your respect. American delegation choose not to do that. So that basically, United States tried very hard to humiliate the host by winning the gold medals, by humiliating them in many different ways. So that you can see even as early at turns of the 20th century, when the United States became just an economic superpower, they decided to show off or to establish their supremacy in sports, in economy, in trade, in so-called culture, in many different ways to replace Great Britain. So United States, of course, eventually from 1896, when the first modern Olympic game took place, till now, United States was a dominant player in the Olympic Games. I did some calculation. So United States definitely was a number one in all gold medals, number one in all medals. The second one was Russia, or former Soviet Union, was in a distant second. So that started, United States established its so-called promise, so-called supreme position through sports as early as 1896. Then United States, of course, also is the only country so far is going to host 4 Summer Olympic Games. It hosted 1932, 1984, 1996, and 96. Then in 2028, Los Angeles will host its 3rd Olympic Games. So again, when we talk about US-UK rivalry in the past, maybe it gives us some historical background to think about US-China relations. Now let's return to China. So in 1984, China won the 18 gold medals in Los Angeles, but in 2008, the Chinese won the largest number of gold medals in Beijing 2008. Of course, we have 48 gold medals won by Chinese, US only 36 gold medals. In this year's Tokyo Olympic Games, only in last day, the United States surpassed China in gold medal by 1, 39 to 38. So you can see from the sports perspective, US-China rivalry has been there, just like US-UK at turns of the 20th century was there. So again, US-UK so-called reverse of fortune took place peacefully. So if the history can give us guidance, then we can say maybe not that bad, right? So just have to be destined for the war, as some talking had argued. So again, for those of us who grew up during Cultural Revolution, we all remember the slogan in sports: 友谊第一，比赛第二, friendship first, competition second. So now return to US-China relations. Should we say competition first, friendship second, or for both nations? As a very famous American football coach once declared, winning is everything and only sin. So we don't know. But one thing is, no matter whether or not China is the number one economically or soon to be number one economically, but the rivalry between US-China relations through sports has been there since 2008. So let me end it with 2 photos. Actually, the images I found it in the headquarters of IOC, International Olympic Committee in Switzerland. As Yahweh just mentioned, the Chinese diplomat and US diplomat meet in Switzerland just recently. So that's a gift from PRC Olympic delegation to IOC, International Olympic Committee. That basically, I call that we can march to the world even naked. Now that's a gift from Taiwan. Chinese Taipei Olympic Committee. So Tai Chi man, right? We play Tai Chi. So again, we also could use these two images to think about U.S.-China relations, how we can improve or to take care of U.S.-China relations. So I think I promised to talk about less than 1 hour. So now let me stop here, turn to my dear friend, Professor Han Chao, to share his, to listen to his criticism, his comments. So, all right, thank you.
Thanks, Guoqi, for that brilliant presentation. I think it's fascinating. You end up on whether competition is going to be first or friendship, will still be treasured, or winning is everything and the only thing. I hope that's not going to be the case. But before we're going to have a discussion, let's first turn to Professor Han Chao for his comment on Professor Xu's presentation. Han Chao, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Professor Liu and Professor Xu, for your very detailed and insightful presentation on the role of sports in U.S.-China relation in recent 1.5 century. Today, I came here to basically fulfill my responsibility for the China Research Center, which is one of the co-sponsors for this event. I myself is not a 专家 or whatever you call it in a particular field. So I can only give some rather casual comments. First of all, as Yahweh mentioned, your approach is very refreshing. I have been attending quite a lot of meetings, seminars, public lectures in recent years on U.S.-China relation. Almost all of them are dealing with topics like diplomacy, Taiwan issue, human rights, trade issues. If talking about history of U.S.-China relation, then we go to like unequal treaty, Box Rebellion, Korean War, Vietnam War, all these things. So, looking at these major international relations through the lens of sports is really something very refreshing. And I think this is important to look at U.S.-China relation from, as Yahweh put it, people-to-people relation, and from essentially a social historian. So it's from my point of view, it's a sort of everyday life, because sports more or less associated with daily life and social history. And I have another thing. I think you probably today you did not mention too much, but I really like your idea about shared history. That shared history is a really excellent idea, and also is a very precise, very sort of enlightening way to put it. Because today we started talking a lot about global history. But global history sometimes can be too vague and end up by nowhere, because global is so big and it can be everywhere. But shared history can, in this case, U.S.-China, right, can be very precise and very down to earth. So this sports history, it is really a shared history. I think you probably should apply for patent for the term shared history. 申请专利 shared history. You have book the title. One of your books is shared history, but I think that's very smart title or very good approach. Some years ago, I did research on Sir Robert Hart, the maritime custom, head of Chinese maritime custom. Because of that research, I paid a lot of attention to Burlingame. So today, when I see your PowerPoint said China's true American friend, I was so impressed. First of all, because when I did my research, this man, Pu Anchen, is one of the enemy of China, sort of. But actually, what he did is really help China a great deal at the condition at that time, the Qing dynasty in the 1870s. And he first served as a U.S. envoy, or maybe today you can call ambassador to Qing China. Then after his 6 years term ended, he was appointed as Chinese ambassador to Western nation, not just to U.S. And that's I should give Robert Hart credit, because that's all come from Robert Hart's mind to make that appointment. Of course, Robert Hart, a very influential person at that time, and this is still very much related to U.S.-China relation today, because we have so many Chinese students in U.S. All of us mainland-based Chinese student to U.S. with mainland background, and still people are coming, right? I don't know how many. Probably right now we have somewhere around 50,000 students. I don't know the statistic, but Chinese students keep coming. This all can trace back to Burlingame Treaty with Qing Dynasty. So I think you are brave enough to say he is China's true American friend, and I think we should give Pu Anchen a little bit 平反, and probably compensate him to some extent, because he passed away when he was on duty as a Chinese employee, right? And he was only 49. I think he worked too hard. He died in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, I believe. I guess he got pneumonia. It's too cold there. But anyway, that's my sort of observation. Another observation is about baseball. This baseball team from Connecticut. This is very well known, and these photos are very well known. However, unfortunately, this group of people went back to China, largely vanished. They did not really have any real impact on Chinese society at all. So this first few group of American Chinese students in America, they went back to China. They will see something like someone from another planet. Their behavior was so weird, including address, their hairstyle, everything. So you see how strong the conservative force in China, always there, and this sort of very limited interaction between U.S. and China sometimes just vanished once these people went back to China. So this is sort of two casual comments. And finally, I would like to ask a question about Olympic and Asia. So far we have three major Summer Olympic held in Asia. The first one was 1964 in Tokyo. The second one was 1988 in Seoul. Then the third one is 2008 in Beijing. In each case, this game marked a major turning point in these countries' history, which is not the case in most other nations, especially in the West. Now, the two cities I lived longest in US, one is Los Angeles, another is Atlanta, and both hold Olympic. And I remember UCLA campus still have few places used to serve as the venue for the competition of 1984 Olympic. Then Georgia Tech, where I'm teaching there, I'm still teaching there. Georgia Tech whole campus just turned into Olympic Village, and the parking lot just quickly they built some simple house there. So everything is, of course, it's a great sports event, but no one will elevate this kind of event to a level of national rejuvenation, which is precisely what we do in Beijing. Right? In the Tokyo case, Tokyo Olympics served as a symbol of Japan's return to the global community after defeat, after American occupation. So was the Seoul Olympic event that marked basically the modern South Korea. Before that, it was more or less dictatorship. Then we call Olympic in Beijing. At that time was financial crisis in the West, especially in the US. Then we host these remarkable Olympics there. The opening ceremony was glorious. So that was the beginning of, we start to say, today's Chinese leaders say, Dongsheng Xijiang. That's the beginning of Dongsheng Xijiang, the rise of East and fall of or the decline of the West. So my question is why, in Los Angeles or in Atlanta, it's a great sports event, but nothing related to something like historical turning point of a country. But in East Asia, that's only three countries have that. And I don't think Southeast Asia has ever hosted that. No Africa city hosted that. Latin American just have. So that is something I always puzzle. Although the simple answer is that because they are poor countries, they're third world country. So that's a great deal for them. But still, I would like to say have something more, if from your expert point of view. The second question, again, probably is a little bit big question. Is the sports in China, in Chinese history, always there? It's not just something totally brought by the West. And we all know that the Dunhuang fresco has pictures about many different types of sports, like shooting arrows, riding a horseback, what was this called? Zhu, right? Zhu, which is sort of a type of football or soccer, Chinese soccer, but can choose all the way back to Han Dynasty. And you're talking about boating, competition. But it seems to me that the Chinese sports are more or less individual oriented. Even competition will be individual oriented. Very few sports are team versus team. We talk about ping pong team, team versus team. But Chinese or everything, including Kung Fu movie, or Kung Fu, Tai Chi, Karate, all these individual, like more or less for just individual fitness program, but rather than competition. Of course, competition will bring something like you just mentioned UED, this type of thing. But the Chinese things never really. I don't know. That's my my question. I think it's a little bit too big. But I guess if you have time, probably you could give me some advice.
Thanks, Han Chao, for that.
Let me. I think that the audience must have a lot of questions. So
they do. So, Professor Xu, before you answer one of Professor Lu's question about the, Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing hosting Summer Olympic Games and how they changed these three countries fundamentally. I want to add is the last three games, the Winter Games in South Korea, then this summer, the Tokyo Games, and then the upcoming China Winter Games, once South Korea was hosting the Winter Games, we were hoping that South and North, right, they're going to achieve some sort of reunion. And Tokyo Games, did it make any impact? And what do you say about the upcoming 2022 Winter Olympic Games? So answer the question and also share some thought on the most recent, the past two and then the upcoming one. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. Let me return to Hans-Horst's comments and questions first. So very briefly, I think Hans-Horst made a brilliant comment about the sports history in China. So one major difference, I think Hans-Horst was absolutely right. The Chinese were brilliant in balancing mind, spirit, and body from Asian time till the Sun China, till Sun Chao. As we all know, the Chinese basically invented, because the Olympic Games, by the way, the games, not only sport, because the Wei Qi, I think Yahweh definitely know, Henry Kissinger obsessed with the so-called the brilliant strategy through Wei Qi in the Chinese brilliant mind. So the town Chinese men and women were obsessed with Apollo. That basically now we know we have a hard evidence. But unfortunately, the Chinese interest in sports declined dramatically in Sun China about 1,000 years ago because the Neo-Confucianism, because the Chinese women's practice of food binding, because the Chinese men's obsession with a civil service examination. So one big difference between the Chinese interest in sports after 1895 and previous contribution to sports was basically after 1895, the Chinese basically linked the sports with national honor, with a national pride, with a nationalism, with the national affairs. But before, in previous days, as Hans-Horst mentioned, it's an individual game. They just cultivate their individual values. So that's one thing I emphasize, the shared history, shared values between Chinese and Americans, because from that time, the Chinese invest sports with national and international politics. We also keep in mind, even Chinese has a brilliant history in sports in ancient time. The sports, 体育, the term we imported from Japan, like many terms we use in today's China, like society. So that's one thing. Another thing, that's also basically address the Hans-Horst's question regarding why basically the Olympic Games was so influential in Asia or long Western zones, because for the countries like Asia, also basically, as I will briefly comment to Yahweh's, we have to redeem ourselves or to prove ourselves. That's why I draw our attention to the Chinese translation of Olympiad. I can compete. The Japanese, the Chinese, the Koreans, or many or including South Africans, they all basically try to use a major so-called mega sport events to the world to demonstrate they are able, they are competitive, they are worthy players in the world politics. So that's why basically, because Japan, by the way, is the first country after Western zones basically host Olympic Games, because Japan, by Tokyo, was honored to host the first long Western Olympic game in as early as 1940. But again, Tokyo had to forfeit that honor. Basically, the Japanese basically argued they have to use that event to prove to the West that Japan was a competitive nation. So the same thing happened to Korea, South Korea, to China, or many the future followers in non-Western zone. Because return to Yahweh or Hanzhou Common, why Western countries, after the host, the legacy was not that important. Just I think also the comment from the audience, because the United States, by the way, they always separate the national government, the federal government never spend actually provide official sponsorship to the Olympic Games because they don't provide the federal funding to sports games. There's always private enterprise. So by in country like Japan, in country like China, sports is a national politics, it's a national undertaking. It's a political, we never hire from that. That's why from day one, they basically try to link the sports to tell the world, I can compete. China was not sick man of Asia, right? So again, that's return to Yahweh's comments about the legacy of 2018 South Koreans Winter Olympic Games. That's of course, before the opening ceremony, the world was deeply worried about unstable situation in Korea zones, right? But then with the opening ceremony, they basically it's a 180% degree reverse because that paved the way for summit between the North Korean leaders and South Korean leaders. So could I also argue could next year's Winter Olympic Games in Beijing do achieve certain things? I guess it's difficult to say, but so again, I'm a historian, so I don't know. So hopefully they can learn a lesson from ping pong diplomacy, use the sports brilliantly for international or national politics, but that I don't know. So should we, last thing about, I think Hanzhou comment about boy student. I basically sort of a little bit disagree with Hanzhou on their on what happened to the boy student when they returned to China. They did actually, each of them achieved brilliantly for themselves, for national. I mentioned Zhang Tianyou's contribution in engineering. Tang Shaoyi served as a first premier, but each of them actually achieved a lot. Also, basically, in very private way, they serve as a messenger, even ambassadors between the Chinese and their host families in US or in a broadly defined. For example, for those of us who study Zhang Tianyou, you have to go to his host family in US because each year he sent detailed report letters about his achievement, about national politics. Also, they sent the extraordinary gifts to their host families. They all happen. So that's again, I will stop here. Then maybe so Yahweh, should I answer some questions from the audience, which I can find from the chat?
Yeah, I'll pose those questions. So one question that was asked by Thomas Ostrander, he actually was at University of Michigan when the Chinese team visited. So his question is, you mentioned in your presentation that the US helped China to get into the 1934 Olympic Games. His question is, who was instrumental? Was it the government or was the society that helped the China to participate, even though China only sent one player? And related to that question is a question about the 1904 St. Louis Olympic Games. Did China send anyone to that game?
Okay, all right, great. University of Michigan, by the way, played a significant role in ping pong diplomacy. If I have time, I will also the great state of Michigan, where I spent 10 years there, including Detroit, played important role of facilitating ping pong diplomacy in the very, very important way. I will hopefully have. So now return to 1932 Olympic Game. That's individuals, the Chinese elite. For example, it's Zhang Xueliang. Remember, his hometown, the northeast part of China, was under Japanese occupation. So Zhang Xueliang personally donated $8,000 to help Liu Changchun to go to US. His brother, Zhang Xuemin, the Tianjin mayor, donate the uniforms or others. Then significant sport play for leaders like Wang Zhengchen. He was the first Chinese member in International Olympic Committee. So the individuals, society, need in their individual ways actually played significant role in sending China's first participation in Olympic Games. So that basically, of course, American individuals played important role as well, because as I mentioned earlier in my brief presentation, American hosts basically just simply accept Chinese application to join, even we miss the deadline. So that's a lot of shared history between the Chinese and Americans, among the Chinese individuals and among the American individuals. So the one major difference for my research, basically, I pay more attention to individual history, to the shared history between individuals, not at the governmental level or the long human level, because after all, history is going to be made by individuals, not the abstract organizations. So that's again for 1908, 1904, St. Louis. By the way, that the Olympic Games was honored to Chicago during that time. But then, of course, St. Louis has hosted the so-called World Expo. So obviously, cannot you have two cities in U.S. to host both. So eventually, St. Louis served as a host for 1904 Olympic Games. But again, that games, by the way, was most famous for some racist legacy of that, because, for example, they do some tests about individual different races, their contribution, their skills in sports. Then the Chinese, the Great Qing Dynasty, Qing did actually take part in Expo, but they did not send athlete to the games. So that have to then again the first. There's also some Chinese, by the way, got involved in exhibition games in 1924 at Paris, when Paris hosted that game, but that's only exhibition. So the first real participation from the Chinese was, as far as I can tell, it's in 1932 Olympic Games. Let me briefly just mention the Michigan or University of Michigan involvement, because I think basically the National Committee on U.S.-China relations serve, that's again, it's a non-profit, there's a non-official organization. They played significant role in ping-pong diplomacy, but basically the chair of the National Committee of U.S.-China relations was an economic professor at University of Michigan. He played important role in bringing Chinese ping-pong delegation for return visit to U.S. So that's why basically University of Michigan got involved. Well, last thing, by the way, for the first act of ping-pong diplomacy, because the president of the U.S. ping-pong delegation was a human resource department official at the automobile company in Detroit. So this guy, of course, was not versed in diplomacy, was not polished in many ways, but because his role or capacity as a president of U.S. ping-pong delegation, so he basically so he was respected or honored with that role to facilitate ping-pong diplomacy. That's why Nixon invited him to White House immediately after the 1971 ping-pong championship. So he was also get involved in the ping-pong diplomacy in 1972. So it's a brilliant. There's a lot of stories there. For example, some later on very distinguished China scholars, including Perry Link, served as an interpreter for the Chinese ping-pong delegation. That's a lot of story there. Unfortunately, when we talk about ping-pong diplomacy, we just focus on diplomacy, forgot the individuals, especially the forgotten individuals. Because of their contribution, their involvement, the ping-pong diplomacy eventually will carry out because, for example, from Mao, he has no idea about the detailed arrangement in sports policy in U.S. because he did not understand because the ping pong has nothing to do with the American government. He assumed it's just the same thing, but of course they have to. That's why basically when United States invite Chinese ping pong delegation for return visit, American government cannot spend one single penny to host them because to separate sport. So that's why it's up to the National Committee on U.S.-China relations to raise money to basically to facilitate everything. Because in theory, the White House, Henry Kissinger, and all so-called politicians cannot officially get involved in this. Even, of course, Richard Nixon invited ping pong delegation visit White House. So that's a different story. So Yahweh, I stop here.
Yeah, you were talking about the role of the individuals. In 2011, President Carter was invited to go to China and to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the ping pong diplomacy. This had nothing to do really with him. But, we were hoping to see Zhuang Zedong. And of course, he was nowhere to be seen. He was still alive at the time.
That's right. He was.
So I wonder if you could share, talking about the role of the individuals, do you know what happened to him? And, in the latter years of his life, he's really instrumental in ping pong diplomacy. You showed his picture in your power slide. So if you have anything to share with the audience, that would be great.
All right. Zhuang Zedong, he benefited from ping pong diplomacy. He paid huge price for his contribution in ping pong diplomacy because he was politically very sensitive guy. So that's why when Mr. Cohen, the hippie player from U.S., by mistake jumped into Chinese the bus, which of course with the Chinese ping pong players, nobody dared to talk to Mr. Cohen. But Zhuang Zedong remembered the quotations from Chairman Mao, published on People's Daily. 世界人民包括美国人民也是我们的朋友 right? So he said, "You are my friend." So he basically he shook his hand. Then of course they exchanged the gift. But because Mao basically of course paid attention to Zhuang Zedong, then he became basically the sport minister during before Mao's death. Unfortunately, because after Cultural Revolution, after the arrest of King of Four, then he was treated as a part of King of Four. So he lost his powerful position. He ended up in jail. Then he basically eventually become nobody. I think as a coach for the so-called street level ping pong clubs. So he got, of course, he also got divorced from his famous musician wife. Eventually, he got married with his Japanese admirer or Japanese woman. She admired him very much. So he basically, again, that's about tragic part of history. Somebody, because of political issues, we tend to forget his contribution. That's what I basically say. If we pay attention to the shared history by basically not obsessed with the politics or with either diplomatically or international or domestic, we may evaluate or tell the true story or picture more objectively. Because for the reason why basically we don't really understand the background or detailed history of ping pong diplomacy, because we basically, I think at least as far as in China, we still don't know how to, or official history, how to treat Zhuang Zedong, because they have something to do with the Cultural Revolution, something to do with what happened to him, right? So again, that's a long story. So, by the way, for those of us who are interested in the archives about ping pong diplomacy, the University of Michigan, that's a Butler Historical Library, has a detailed oral history record about ping pong diplomacy. Oxenberg, who was in University of Michigan, so he basically decided to do this. Unfortunately, very few. When I used that, I realized very few people even paid attention to the connections. Even even later on, 40th anniversary or this year's 50th anniversary, we again, as I mentioned, we just pay attention to the big picture of diplomacy. but forgot the human history, forgot the individual history. Or that actually is supposed to be more important, especially when we talk about when U.S.-China relation in a bad shape now. We talk about people-to-people diplomacy, people-to-people relationship. That's what I talk about. That's also why I started with a boy student, because these boy students, they were pioneers in whatever way we pay attention, including sports. Remember, baseball is called the national pastime, national game, but it's become Chinese. So the Chinese are very smart. They can do this. Even they're basically like a crew, as a coxswain, as a hunter, or as a basically baseball players. But we tend to forget that. Also, as a discussion, Hans Ho, Brandon mentioned, we Chinese actually made significant contribution to sports in the Asian time, but we seem to forgot that too, right? Again, let me stop here.
The segue you mentioned about the shared history. So the question came up multiple times, and Han Chao also said you should copyright shared history as a concept. So the difference, what's the difference between shared history and transnational history?
Okay, that's excellent. Because as Han Chao did mention, because I tried to write the trilogy of shared history. So the first one, I think many of us maybe know, published the first volume in the trilogy called the Chinese and Americans, a shared history. The second one called Asia and Great War, a shared history. I'm just finishing the third one called the Idea of China, ? Basically with I don't know whether or not they allow me to use a shared history as subtitle, because the shared history literally it's a one step ahead, or basically that based on transnational history. But shared history basically because transnational history, you can discuss the difference, the confrontation, but the shared history literally say from the background of transnational history, we focus on the shared journey, the shared destiny, the shared vision, or sometimes just basically for some reason. Just give you one example. During the 1914, the first year of the First World War, when the British soldiers and German soldiers tried to shoot each other at the so-called no man's land, one day they get so bored they decide to have a football competition. Then with the understanding nobody will shoot each other, right? That's shared history. That's shared experience. Even the both groups end up in the opposite side. So basically, the shared history is focused on individual level, focus on non-political level, focus on non-diplomatic level, talk about human history, talk about shared frustration, shared vision, shared dream, or shared nightmares. That's what I try to do. So it's a very complicated, so I don't think I have too much time to go to detail, but for those of them who are interested, basically, I will be honored. You can read the shared history between Chinese Americans, also the shared history between the Asians, which of course Han Chao mentioned about the shared destiny of Olympic Games between Chinese, American, the Japanese and Koreans. So even in the First World War, Japan, China is supposed to be on the opposite sides. They were the real enemies towards, but they have a lot of shared frustration, shared obsession, shared dream, right? We all know, basically, we talk about the May 4th movement, but the Koreans have a March 1st movement first. That basically the May 4th movement basically it's a follow the footprint of a March 1st event in Korea, right? So that again, that's a lot of because when we focus on too much on confrontations, too much on difference, of course they exist, don't decline, they don't exist, but also we can focus on something we usually ignore or 视而不见, right? It's there, it's important, but just from different perspective. We see the picture more broadly, or basically complete picture, just like Su Dongpo's very famous poem, 不是庐山真面目, right? 只缘身在此山中. So that's so it's I spent, I guess, many years to think about it. Hopefully, with the idea of China, then I will bring my so-called trilogy to the end. Then basically with the U.S.-China relations, with Asia, then with a broadly defined idea of China into focus, so that each of them deal with one big topic. So hopefully, then together, I guess you can decipher my so-called my thinking about this.
We have reached the end, but I'm not going to lose the opportunity to ask you one more question before we're going to end today's webinar. The question will start with sports, but will end on U.S.-China relationship. So you briefly mentioned President Carter's decision to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympic Games. President Carter is not a popular president. I mean, until today, many Americans still don't like him because he made the decision to return the Panama Canal. And many Americans didn't like him because he did not allow American athletes to compete in Moscow. Many of them didn't like him because he abandoned Taiwan and all of that. But when President Carter asked the worldwide, all the heads of state to boycott the games, here in the US, there's a lot of debate, consultation. In China, was that just as you described, it was a quick decision by Hua Guofeng, or did anything happen before Hua Guofeng sent a letter to President Carter saying we're 100% behind your decision to boycott? And use this as a segue, since we are all avid and keen watchers of the relationship. You talk about competition and friendship. So where do you think the relationship is going to go? Are you a optimist, or you're a pessimist in terms of where this relationship is going, and how the state-to-state relationship is going to impact people to people? And what will be our shared history in the coming years? Yeah, so okay. It's a big question, but the floor is yours. And with that answer, we'll wrap up today's webinar.
Yeah, as a historian, I think I'm cautiously optimistic about future Sino-American relations, because especially from the shared history perspective, because you can see basically 50 years ago, before ping-pong diplomacy, the relationship between China and US even worse. Now, basically, you can see, right, it's from person to person perspective. It's both Sino-American relations and people to people relations are very closely interlinked. So return to the Jimmy Carter's call to boycott Moscow game. As I mentioned, basically, American Olympic Committee even refused to follow his order, because remember, U.S. Olympic Committee, by definition, is private. It's a non-political. A president, even sitting president of the United States, cannot order the American Olympic Committee to boycott. So basically, it take many months for U.S. Including American Congress to jump the boat to take part for the boycott. It takes many months for American close allies, including Western Germany, including Japan, including UK, to support him. By the way, UK did take part in 1980 Olympic Moscow Games. For China, again, I think basically even Hua Guofeng as a premier sent a one-page letter to Jimmy Carter in Chinese. Of course, I think it's a joint decision, especially with the support of Deng Xiaoping, because for Deng Xiaoping, he was a major player in China's return to Olympic movement. He was a big fan of China's participation in Moscow Games. He was the first Chinese politician, by the way, to openly, in People's Republic of China, to talk about host Olympic Games very soon, when he was interviewed by Japanese reporter as early as 1979. But again, it's talk about shared history, United States and China has a one shared obsession. That's Soviet Union. So when both countries deal with how to deal with the Soviet Union, so they can reach the decision very easily. So that's why I don't think that the Chinese internal discussions about the boycott is that basically to basically have a difficulty to reach the consensus. So that's again, I don't have access to the detailed document from Foreign Ministry, but that's my hunch, because when Deng Xiaoping visited United States in 1979, basically, of course, remember he the first request to Jimmy Carter administration for U.S. support of him to fight against Vietnam. Right, that's again is something there. Oh, and let me briefly address one question from the audience about the numbers of gold medal in 2008. The person mentioned is a 51 gold medal won by Chinese. He or she was absolutely right, but unfortunately, the reason I use a 48 gold medal because China lost 3 gold medals because the drug issue. They're all, by the way, deal with us the weightlifting. So now officially we have a 48 gold medals for 2008 Olympic Games. Even during 2008 game period, we have 51. So that's just one short answer to that question. Again, thank you so much, Yao and Han Chao, or the folks either in US or everywhere to listen to my rambling talks on sports. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we say goodbye to each other, I just want, we still have 152 people online. Just to give you some statistics, 535 people have registered for this webinar. At the peak today, we have close to 210 that were online to listen to the presentation by Professor Guoqi Xu. So another notice, we're going to have next webinar, again, co-organized with the China Research Center in Atlanta at 7 o'clock on Beijing time, October the 20th. So this one is the National Town Hall. The national speaker is Fareed Zakaria, is a very famous TV host and commentator. And our local speaker is Jordan Snyder. Jordan Snyder is the host of China Talk podcast. He's a joint product, if I can use that word, of Washington University as well as Beida. He graduated from Yanjing Xuetang not a few years ago. So he has a huge following, and the theme of the topic will be on technology, innovation, and regulation and US-China relationship. So it should be a good one. We hope you're all going to come back. It will start at 7 o'clock. It's a little early, but you can skip the early part. It's 7 o'clock, it's too early. But our local one starts at 8 o'clock, October the 20th, Beijing time. So thank you all. We'll see you in the coming weeks and months. And hopefully we can get Professor Xu to come back after the Winter Olympic Games to do another shared history presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.